The unthinkable transaction. What if the most consequential decision in American history wasn't made by a president, but by a bookish, forgotten diplomat, negotiated in secret, and paid for with a ghost fleet of gold-laden ships that may never have existed? In the winter of 1802, in the muddy, disease-ridden streets of Washington, D.C., the young American Republic was suffocating. Its lungs were the Mississippi River, and the air had just been cut off. The news that had arrived via slow, storm-tossed packets from Europe was an announcement of doom. Spain, America's shaky neighbor and reluctant gatekeeper, had secretly ceded the entire Louisiana territory, a staggering 828,000 square miles stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border, back to France. Not just France, but the France of Napoleon Bonaparte. For President Thomas Jefferson, a man who cherished a republic of small farmers and feared the corruption of large cities, this was an existential threat. Napoleon was a modern Caesar, an autocrat with a conquering army, and he now controlled the crucial port of New Orleans. Without the ability to ship goods freely down the Mississippi and through New Orleans, the settlers in Tennessee, Kentucky, and Ohio would be forced to pay tribute to a foreign power, a power that could, and likely would, choke off their commerce and stifle the nation's growth. Jefferson's worst fear was not a war, but an alliance of desperation. The Western settlers, seeing their lifeblood controlled by France, might secede and form their own nation, perhaps even aligning with Great Britain for protection. The Union would shatter barely a decade after its founding. Jefferson knew he had to act fast, and he had to be subtle. He decided on a risky, almost impossible mission: dispatch his trusted friend and former minister to France, James Monroe, back to Paris with an unprecedented authorization. Monroe's official instructions, penned by Secretary of State James Madison, were narrow and precise. Offered to buy New Orleans and the Floridas from the French for a maximum of $10 million. But Paris in 1803 was not a city of diplomacy. It was the capital of a restless empire. Napoleon, having crushed all opposition and now styling himself first consul for life, was preparing to invade Great Britain and rule the continent. He saw the vast, untamed wilderness of Louisiana not as a territory, but as a granary and a strategic base to humble his enemies. His plans were vast and absolute. When James Monroe finally arrived in Paris on April 13, 1803, rain-soaked and exhausted, he found the American minister, Robert R. Livingston, utterly defeated. Livingston, an old-school New York statesman, had been fruitlessly negotiating with French officials for months, facing nothing but indifference and disdain. He had recently written to Madison, admitting, "There is no doubt that the first consul is determined to keep it." The mission was dead on arrival. Monroe and Livingston held a desperate late-night conference at Livingston's residence, preparing to deliver the bad news back to Washington. But then, the unbelievable happened. On the morning of April 13, 1803, Livingston was summoned by Napoleon's foreign minister, the infamous, wily, and politically slippery Charles Maurice du Talleyrand-Périgord. Talleyrand, a former bishop who had survived the Terror and now served the consul, was a man whose every word was a calculated risk. Livingston arrived expecting another frustrating dismissal. Instead, Talleyrand posed a direct, astonishing question. What would the United States give for the whole of Louisiana? Livingston was stunned to silence. He hadn't been authorized to buy the whole territory, which was geographically immense, culturally diverse, and frankly, terrifyingly expensive. His instructions were for New Orleans and the Floridas only, for $10 million. Talleyrand repeated the offer, watching the American diplomat squirm. Livingston, recovering his composure, made a lowball offer, 20 million francs, about $3.75 million. Talleyrand scoffed and walked away, claiming the offer was ridiculous. The next day, April 14th, Monroe and Livingston met again with the French Minister of Finance, François Barbé-Marbois, a man known to be more favorable to American interests. Barbé-Marbois, speaking with an urgency that betrayed the true stakes of the negotiation, laid out Napoleon's final non-negotiable price, 100 million francs, or about $18.5 million, plus the cancellation of $3.75 million in debt France owed to American citizens, making the final purchase price $15 million. This was an order of magnitude beyond their budget. It was twice the entire annual budget of the United States government. They were instructed to spend $10 million for a tiny fraction of the land being offered. But here was the truth, the secret no one in Washington could have known. Napoleon had abruptly reversed his entire imperial strategy. News had reached him of a devastating defeat in the Caribbean. His vast army, sent to suppress the slave revolt in the sugar-rich colony of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, had been utterly decimated by the combined forces of yellow fever and the brilliant generalship of former slave Toussaint Louverture, who had since been captured, but whose forces fought on. Napoleon had lost 50,000 men. Without Saint-Domingue as a staging and supply base, Louisiana was strategically worthless to him. Furthermore, the truce with Great Britain was crumbling and war was imminent. Napoleon needed two things immediately: money to fund his invasion of England and to deny the territory to the British, who he feared would simply seize it. The negotiation was no longer about French ambition. It was about Napoleon's desperate need for cash and his grand strategy against his oldest enemy. Monroe and Livingston faced an impossible dilemma: defy their president and spend the country into bankruptcy, or obey their instructions and condemn the young nation to a slow, suffocating death. They knew, with a certainty that transcended diplomacy, that this window, this moment of Napoleon's strategic panic, would close forever. They made their decision. They accepted the price. On April 30th, 1803, the treaty was signed, purchasing not just New Orleans, but an empire that would double the size of the United States. The Louisiana Purchase was complete. The fact-rich anomaly. What they actually bought. The Louisiana Purchase was not a simple land transfer. It was a geographic paradox that defied American knowledge. The area purchased was 828,000 square miles, adding 15 new states to the Union, including states that had not even been conceived of, such as Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana. The purchase price of $15 million works out to approximately 3 cents per acre, or $280 million in 2024 dollars, a bargain for an area roughly the size of the modern-day European Union. A geographic mystery. The treaty contained no defined western border. It simply transferred the territory as fully and in the same manner as they had been acquired by the French Republic. The land was described as the island of New Orleans and the territory called Louisiana. The U.S. had, literally, bought a mountain range and the headwaters of the Missouri River without knowing they existed or where the purchase ended.
The astonishing truth, the ghost ships of Philadelphia. The purchase was made, but the money, $15 million, was not sitting in a vault in Washington. The fledgling U.S. Treasury was nearly empty. The entire national revenue in 1802 was barely $12 million. This is where the story pivots from diplomatic negotiation to high finance, involving the most powerful European banking houses and a strange, nearly forgotten transaction. The United States did not pay Napoleon directly. The transfer of such a massive amount of specie, gold or silver, was logistically impossible and politically dangerous. Instead, the U.S. Treasury issued $11.25 million in U.S. government bonds. These bonds were then immediately purchased by two European banking firms. The London-based Baring & Company, headed by Alexander Baring, and the Amsterdam-based Hope & Company, headed by Pierre Le Boucher. These two banks, representing the major financial power centers of America's chief rival, Britain, and Napoleon's old enemy, Holland, essentially paid Napoleon's government on behalf of the United States. The process was incredible. The U.S. Treasury, through its agent Nicholas Biddle, wrote a contract for a huge loan at 6% interest. Baring and Hope bought the American debt at a discount, paying approximately $8.8 million in actual cash. This cash, now French money, was delivered via a series of secret, highly secured transactions in European financial centers. The Ghost Fleet. The actual payment to Napoleon was a massive transfer of specie that had to be transported across the Atlantic. The French treasury needed to receive the gold and silver quickly. The funds acquired by the banks were loaded onto ships. Historians have records of a French frigate, Lafayette, being dispatched to transport some of the funds, but the scale of the transaction required multiple ships to move the bullion. American folklore, particularly around Philadelphia and New Orleans, whispers of a ghost fleet, a temporary armed squadron of ships commissioned by the banks and the American government, laden with kegs of Spanish silver and gold coins, sailing under a mixture of French, American, and British flags for protection to deliver the cash to Napoleon's agents. This fleet was a necessary logistical step, a temporary shadow navy of credit without which the deal would have been impossible. The final delivery was so swift and secret that the details were immediately suppressed, creating a financial legend where gold literally bought a continent. The ultimate irony? The money Napoleon received, paid in large part by British financiers, Baring & Company, went directly into funding his war machine for the upcoming war against Great Britain. The Louisiana Purchase was thus an act of unprecedented constitutional daring by Jefferson, and moment of extraordinary diplomatic opportunity seized by Monroe and Livingston, and a massive, complex financial transaction managed by European bankers that leveraged American debt to buy a North American empire for the price of 3 cents an acre. The constitutional conundrum and the core of discovery. Jefferson's intellectual hypocrisy. Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence and the champion of strict adherence to the Constitution, now faced the ultimate test of his political philosophy. He was by nature an anti-federalist, a believer that the government's powers were strictly limited to those explicitly enumerated in the Constitution. The power to acquire foreign territory was not explicitly listed. When the treaty arrived in Washington, carried by a swift-sailing ship in July 1803, Jefferson was ecstatic over the outcome, but immediately paralyzed by the method. The purchase was a stunning achievement for the nation, but a devastating blow to his core principles. Quote from Jefferson, August 12, 1803. The executive, in seizing the fugitive occurrence which so much advances the good of their country, have done an act beyond the Constitution. The legislature, in casting behind them metaphysical subtleties and risking themselves like faithful servants, must cure the irregularity by an amendment of the Constitution. Jefferson believed he had done a great good, but he saw it as an illegal act that required an ex post facto, after the fact, constitutional amendment to legalize the purchase. He immediately began drafting an amendment that would specifically grant the power to acquire territory and incorporate it into the Union.
But Jefferson's political allies, particularly Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin and James Madison, urged him to drop the idea of an amendment. They argued that if he waited, his political opponents, the Federalists, would use the amendment debate to attack the treaty, raise metaphysical subtleties that would delay the process and potentially sink the whole deal. They advised him to use the implied treaty-making powers of the presidency and argue that the power to acquire territory was a logical extension of the government's sovereignty. The historical irony is profound. The strict constructionist Jefferson, facing the greatest opportunity for the nation, was forced to adopt the broad, flexible interpretation of the Constitution he had always opposed. Reluctantly, Jefferson deferred to the political urgency. He dropped the amendment and submitted the treaty to the Senate for ratification in October 1803. The Federalists predictably erupted in opposition. They argued, unconstitutional debt. The purchase obligated the country to a massive long-term national debt, something they claimed Jefferson, the opponent of Hamilton's financial system, was hypocritically doing himself. Dilution of power. They feared that the influx of new agrarian Western states would forever diminish the power of the original 13 states and the mercantile interests of New England. Senator Uriah Tracy of Connecticut famously warned that this new territory was a dreary wilderness beyond the Mississippi, an empire of savages and wild beasts. The threat of secession. They darkly predicted that the territory was so vast it could never be governed as one nation, leading to a breakup into multiple republics. Despite the intense debate, the Senate ratified the treaty on October 20, 1803, by a vote of 24-7. The necessity of controlling the Mississippi River trumped all ideological reservations. The grand challenge, mapping the unknown. With the stroke of a pen, the United States had bought a geographic mystery. No European or American mapmaker possessed an accurate understanding of what lay beyond the Mississippi's bend. The maps that existed were based on conjecture, distorted Spanish accounts, and indigenous folklore. The territory was rumored to contain a massive salt mountain that could be mined for a lifetime. The elusive Northwest Passage, a water route connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Gigantic, shaggy bears that dwarfed anything known in the East. Lost Spanish gold mines, and perhaps even the legendary Welsh Indians, a tribe descended from an ancient Welsh prince. Jefferson, who had been planning an expedition to the West long before the purchase was even conceivable, now had an urgent national mandate. The land had to be claimed, mapped, understood, and defended. The commanders, 2 men, 1 purpose. For this task, Jefferson chose 2 men whose talents perfectly complemented each other. Captain Meriwether Lewis, 1774 to 1809. Jefferson's personal secretary, a former Army captain, and a man known for his meticulous, disciplined nature and boundless physical courage. Lewis was dispatched to Philadelphia for a crash course in everything needed for the journey: botany, zoology, celestial navigation, and medicine. Lieutenant William Clark, 1770 to 1838, a former comrade of Lewis's, an expert woodsman, and a brilliant cartographer. His skill in drawing accurate, detailed maps and managing the expedition's logistical nightmare would prove indispensable. Jefferson's instructions to Lewis were a masterpiece of scientific and political ambition, often referred to by historians as the Magna Carta of the American West. Lewis was ordered to determine the latitude and longitude of all major geographic features, study the flora, fauna, and geology of the region, collecting samples and detailed drawings, establish friendly relations with the indigenous tribes, learning their languages, customs, and laws, Identify the most direct and practicable water communication across the continent for the purposes of commerce, i.e., find the Northwest Passage. The expedition, officially known as the Corps of Discovery, set out from Camp Dubois near St. Louis.
The astonishing truth. The Army of Science and the Unknown Woman. The Corps of Discovery was not a standard military campaign. It was a floating, mobile scientific academy. The initial party consisted of approximately 40 men, designated as soldiers, hunters, and boatmen, but they were all trained to act as scientists, scribes, and anthropologists. They carried with them an enormous array of equipment, 193 pounds of portable soup, a paste made of dried meat, bone, and vegetables, sophisticated sextants for navigation, 4 gallons of concentrated laudanum or opium, and thousands of trinkets, beads, knives, looking glasses for trade with Native Americans. The air rifle. Lewis carried an advanced, Austrian-made Drondoni air rifle, capable of firing 22 shots without reloading. This was a technological marvel that often intimidated and astonished tribal leaders, lending great authority to the American delegation without the need for open conflict. The role of Sacagawea. The Corps' success was due in no small part to a 16-year-old Shoshone woman named Sacagawea, circa 1788 to 1812. She was the wife of Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian fur trapper hired by Lewis and Clark as an interpreter. She was a prisoner of the expedition's first major contact, the Mandan Hidatsa villages in present-day North Dakota, having been kidnapped from her Shoshone people years earlier. Her true value was revealed when the expedition reached the headwaters of the Missouri River and desperately needed horses from the Shoshone to cross the formidable Rocky Mountains. When Sacagawea came face to face with the chief of the Shoshone band, she recognized him. He was her older brother, Kameawet. The emotional reunion, a miracle of timing and chance, immediately secured the necessary horses and guides for the expedition to continue. More than just a guide or interpreter, Sacagawea's presence was a badge of peace. The sight of a woman, and later her infant son, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, nicknamed Pompey by Clark, traveling with the group, signaled to every tribe they encountered that the Corps was not a war party. Without Sacagawea, it is highly probable the expedition would have been wiped out in the Rockies. The unthinkable scale, the data collected. When the Corps finally returned to St. Louis in September 1806, after 2 years, 4 months, and 10 days, they had covered over 8,000 miles. Their primary accomplishment was not reaching the Pacific, but the sheer volume of factual data they collected. They had confirmed the absence of a single continuous water route, the Northwest Passage. They documented 178 new species of plants and 122 new species of animals, including the grizzly bear, the prairie dog, and the bighorn sheep. Clark's maps corrected decades of European error, providing the first relatively accurate depiction of the entire western U.S. drainage system, stretching from the Mississippi to the Pacific coast. The Louisiana Purchase, sealed in a banker's contract and funded by European capital, was now grounded in American knowledge, laying the foundation for the next century of westward expansion. The Republic meets the Creole City. The Louisiana Purchase was finalized not just on paper, but in a formal transfer ceremony in New Orleans, the heart of the new territory. On December 20, 1803, in the city's Plaza de Armas, now Jackson Square, the French flag was lowered and the Stars and Stripes was raised. This moment, known as the Transfer of Louisiana, signaled a dramatic shift in sovereignty, but it instantly created an explosive cultural and political clash. The melting pot of New Orleans. New Orleans was unlike any other city in the young United States. It was a centuries-old cultural nexus, not a raw frontier town. The population was an intricate, highly stratified mosaic. Creoles, the largest and most established group, descendants of French and Spanish colonists. They were Catholic, spoke French or Spanish, and maintained a social hierarchy rooted in European traditions. Free people of color, gens de couleur libre, a large and respected community, primarily of mixed European and African descent. They owned property, served in the militia, and were often highly educated, enjoying rights and social standing unheard of in the slave states of the American South. Gaintucks, the rough-hewn, aggressive American frontiersmen who arrived via the Mississippi, often viewed by the Creoles as uncouth barbarians. Slaves, the vast majority of the labor force, primarily West African or Haitian, maintaining a vibrant and unique culture that would define the region. When the Americans arrived, led by the newly appointed governor, William Clyburn, they attempted to impose Anglo-American customs, law, and language overnight. This led to immediate friction. The Code Noir versus Anglo-American law. The most profound clash occurred in the realm of law and society, particularly regarding race. Under the French and Spanish systems, based on the Code Noir, or Black Code, and the later Spanish Siete Partidas, slavery was harsh, but it recognized certain rights for the enslaved and provided a clear path to manumission, or freedom. More critically, the gens de couleur libre enjoyed a codified status that protected their property and rights. The Americans, however, brought with them the laws of the Anglo-American South. These laws were designed to be racially rigid, creating a complete separation between black and white, slave and free. The American system did not recognize the fluid, often prosperous status of the free people of color. Governor Clyburn's attempts to impose American legal practices, such as trial by jury, which the French disliked, and the English common law system, were met with fierce resistance. The Creoles saw the Americans as destroying their ancient legal heritage and threatening the complex social order that had evolved over a century. Astonishing fact, within 5 years of the purchase, the Americanization of New Orleans began to erode the rights of the free people of color, forcing many into a second-class status and stripping them of their autonomy, creating a racial caste system far more rigid than the one they knew under European rule.
The Burr Conspiracy, the shadow of secession. Just as the U.S. was struggling to govern its new asset, a remarkable and bizarre threat to the Union emerged, centered on the newly acquired West, the Burr Conspiracy, 1805 to 1807. Aaron Burr was one of the most polarizing figures in early American history. A hero of the Revolution, a political rival to Jefferson, and the sitting vice president who had famously killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel, Burr was politically ruined and deeply in debt. Following his term as VP, Burr began traveling extensively through the Ohio Valley and down the Mississippi. His movements and meetings were shrouded in secrecy, but historians believe his plan revolved around creating a new, independent nation in the West. His exact intentions remain one of the great historical mysteries. Secession of the West. The most common theory is that he intended to convince Western settlers still feeling alienated from Washington to secede from the Union, taking the Louisiana Territory with them. Invasion of Spanish territory. The more aggressive theory is that Burr aimed to invade Spanish territories like Mexico or Texas, capture them and establish his own empire, with himself as emperor. Burr managed to raise a small, heavily armed private army and secured financial backing from a number of wealthy, powerful figures, including the wealthy Irish immigrant and senator Jonathan Dayton, and the territorial governor of Mississippi, General Wilkinson. Wilkinson, a man of staggering duplicity, was a high-ranking officer in the U.S. Army and a secret paid agent of the Spanish Crown, codename Agent 13. Wilkinson, seeing Burr's plan begin to unravel and fearing exposure, dramatically betrayed Burr. He sent a warning to President Jefferson, exaggerating the scale of Burr's army and falsely claiming Burr planned to seize Washington, D.C. Jefferson, already wary of Burr, took the threat seriously. In 1807, Burr was arrested and charged with treason, the only former vice president in U.S. history to ever face such a charge. The trial and its constitutional legacy. The trial of Aaron Burr, presided over by Chief Justice Marshall, was a legal and political spectacle. Jefferson, certain of Burr's guilt, publicly and aggressively pushed for a conviction. However, Marshall, the great Federalist opponent of Jefferson, insisted on a strict constitutional definition of treason. Marshall ruled that the Constitution, Article 3, Section 3, required treason must consist only in levying war against the United States or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. The overt act of war must be proven by the testimony of 2 witnesses. Since Burr was captured before he could engage in actual combat, Marshall declared there was no overt act of war proven by 2 witnesses. He directed the jury to acquit Burr. The outcome was an astonishing victory for the rule of law over presidential power. It established the high, difficult bar for proving treason in the United States, forever protecting political dissent, and establishing the principle that a president, even one as powerful as Jefferson, could not secure a conviction simply through influence. Burr was acquitted, though his reputation remained ruined, and he lived out his life as a minor figure abroad. The Burr conspiracy proved that the Louisiana Purchase was not just a geographic expansion, but a political vulnerability. A massive territory whose loyalty to the distant capital was tenuous and open to exploitation. The inevitable clash, the Creek War, 1813 to 1814. The exploration and subsequent American settlement of the Louisiana Territory put the U.S. on a direct collision course with the powerful established Native American nations who lived there. The most immediate and violent consequence of the expansion was the Creek War in the Southeast, which included the Mobile and lands west of the Mississippi. The Creek Nation, organized into over 50 towns, was increasingly divided. The White Sticks, or Lower Creeks, advocated for peace, trade, and cultural accommodation with the Americans. The Red Sticks, or Upper Creeks, fiercely traditionalists. They were inspired by the Pan-Indian resistance movement led by the Shawnee chief Tecumseh, who was urging all tribes to reject American encroachment and cultural assimilation. The Red Sticks, fueled by desperation and tradition, launched a war against the Americans and their Creek rivals. The climax of this conflict came at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, March 27, 1814. The scene, the Red Stick Creeks, numbering around 1,200 warriors, fortified themselves in a massive log-fortified bend of the Tallapoosa River. The commander, the American forces were commanded by the future president, General Andrew Jackson, a man obsessed with vengeance and expansion. Jackson led an army of U.S. troops, Tennessee militia, and crucially, allied groups of Lower Creek or White Sticks and Cherokee warriors. The outcome: Jackson's forces surrounded the bend. After a fierce battle, only about 200 Red Stick Creek warriors survived. The battle was a catastrophic defeat for the Creeks. The consequence? The victory allowed Jackson to dictate the Treaty of Fort Jackson, August 14, 1814. Despite the fact that his allied Creeks and Cherokees fought for him, Jackson seized approximately 23 million acres of land, over half of the ancestral Creek domain, effectively crippling the Creek Nation and paving the way for the massive removal policies of the 1830s. The vastness of the Louisiana Purchase demanded the removal of any obstacle to American dominance. The Ghost Fleet's gold had bought a continent, but the cost was now being paid in political strife, legal chaos, and bloodshed.
The final conflict and the birth of American identity. The Louisiana Purchase, in securing the Mississippi River, inadvertently set the stage for the War of 1812, a conflict often called America's Second War of Independence. The massive expansion of territory intensified the existing tensions with Great Britain, leading to a final confrontation over trade, maritime rights, and crucially, the control of North American territory. The Western grievances, land and the British. While the ostensible causes of the War of 1812 were maritime, specifically British impressment of American sailors and interference with neutral trade, the true driving force, particularly among the Western and Southern war hawks in Congress, was land. The vast unknown lands of the Louisiana Purchase were not empty. They were home to powerful Native American nations who were fiercely resisting the rapid encroachment of American settlers. The British, still holding forts in the Great Lakes region despite treaty agreements, saw this resistance as a strategic opportunity. British incitement. British agents in Canada were openly supplying arms, gunpowder, and intelligence to Native American confederacies in the Northwest, led by the brilliant Shawnee chief Tecumseh and his spiritual brother Tenskwatawa, the prophet. The Warhawks' ambition. Western leaders like Henry Clay of Kentucky saw war with Great Britain as the only way to permanently end this British support for the Native Americans, neutralize the British presence on the continent, and clear the path for settlement across the entire Louisiana expanse. The British presence, they argued, made the Purchase vulnerable. The unsinkable frigate and the burning of Washington. The War of 1812 was fought on multiple fronts, but its greatest strategic significance lay in the way it galvanized American identity and solidified control over the continent. The Naval War and the Constitution. Despite the small size of the U.S. Navy, a few heavily armed frigates achieved remarkable victories that shocked the British Royal Navy. The most famous was the USS Constitution, nicknamed Old Ironsides because British cannonballs seemed to bounce off its thick oak hull. Its defeat of the HMS Guerriere in August 1812 provided a massive morale boost to the struggling nation. The invasion of Canada. The Americans launched several ill-fated invasions of Canada. The invasion failed largely due to poor planning and unreliable militia forces. However, in the Battle of the Thames, October 1813, American forces defeated a combined British and Native American force, leading to the death of Tecumseh. This single event shattered the pan-Indian resistance movement in the Old Northwest and permanently ended the British ability to incite Native American conflict south of the Canadian border. The national humiliation. In August 1814, British forces retaliated by landing in the Chesapeake Bay. They easily defeated the American militia and marched into Washington, D.C. The British burned the Capitol building, the Treasury, and the White House, then known as the Executive Mansion. This shocking display of weakness was a profound national humiliation, but acted as a powerful rallying cry for the American people. The defining moment, the Battle of New Orleans. The climactic battle of the war, and arguably the most crucial consequence of the Louisiana Purchase, took place after the war had officially ended. On December 24, 1814, American and British diplomats signed the Treaty of Ghent in Europe, formally ending the war. However, due to the slow speed of transatlantic communication, word of the peace did not reach the commanders in North America in time. The British command, aiming to seize control of the valuable port of New Orleans, the gateway to the entire Louisiana Territory, launched a massive, concentrated invasion force of over 8,000 veteran troops. The commander. The defense of New Orleans was entrusted to General Andrew Jackson, now a national hero after his victories against the Creek Nation. Jackson's defense. Jackson, a brilliant and ruthless commander, assembled an astonishingly diverse force. U.S. Army regulars, Tennessee and Kentucky sharpshooters, Choctaw warriors, local free people of color, the same gens de couleur libre whose rights Claiborne had diminished, and astonishingly a formidable unit of pirates led by the notorious privateer Jean Lafitte. Lafitte provided cannon, gunpowder, and critical knowledge of the local bayous.
The battle, January 8, 1815. The battle itself was a devastating, one-sided affair. The Americans were dug in behind a fortified plant earthworks line along the Rodriguez Canal. The American sharpshooters and artillery unleashed withering fire on the British columns. The British suffered over 2,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or captured, including their commanding general, Sir Edward Pakenham. The Americans suffered fewer than 70 casualties. The historical irony and consequence. Although the battle had no legal impact on the war, its psychological and political impact was immense and enduring. National identity. The victory instantly catapulted Andrew Jackson to national hero status and gave Americans a sense of decisive victory and national pride. It definitively closed the book on the American Revolution, proving the young republic could stand against the greatest military power on the earth. Manifest destiny secured. By holding New Orleans and inflicting such a devastating defeat, the U.S. confirmed its permanent control over the entire Mississippi River Valley and the Louisiana Purchase. The British never again seriously contested American dominance west of the Appalachians. The path was now open for the concept of manifest destiny, the belief that the U.S. was divinely ordained to expand across the entire continent. The rise of the West. The heroes of New Orleans were Westerners, Kentucky and Tennessee militia, and the diverse and polyglot people of Louisiana. The battle shifted the national political center of gravity westward, culminating in the election of the common man and Westerner Andrew Jackson as president in 1828. The legacy of the 3 cents. The historical legacy of the Louisiana Purchase is not just the land itself, but the creation of the modern American state. A precedent of power. Jefferson, through his illegal act of expansion, established the precedent of robust executive power in foreign policy and land acquisition. The Purchase showed that the president could act boldly on the national stage when opportunity dictated. The indigenous tragedy. The acquisition of so much land created an insatiable hunger for territory. The displacement and marginalization of Native American tribes became not just a tragic consequence, but a formalized genocidal policy, culminating in the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and the Trail of Tears, as the nation sought to fulfill its destiny by emptying the purchased lands for settlement. The seeds of civil war. The Purchase immediately resurrected the most divisive question in American history: slavery. Would the new territories be slave or free? The attempt to maintain a balance led directly to the Missouri Compromise, 1820, and the perpetual struggle that would ultimately erupt into the Civil War. The 3-cent per acre bargain bought a continent, but it also bought a ticking bomb of sectional conflict. From a few worried diplomats in Paris defying their orders, to a complex network of European bankers funding a new empire, to a final bloody battle fought by pirates and frontiersmen in the Louisiana Bayou, the Louisiana Purchase transformed the United States from a fragile coastal republic into a vast continental power.
Manifest destiny and the trails of commerce and conquest. The Louisiana Purchase provided the canvas for the 19th century American saga of manifest destiny, the driving ideology that the U.S. was destined to expand its dominion and spread democracy across the entire North American continent. With the Purchase secured by the victory in the War of 1812, the focus shifted from acquisition and defense to exploration and settlement. The unknown territory became a magnet for ambitious traders, desperate settlers, and audacious explorers, leading to the creation of the Great Western Trails. The Santa Fe Trail, Commerce and Spanish Gold, 1821 to 1880. While the Lewis and Clark expedition forged a path of scientific discovery to the Pacific, the Santa Fe Trail was born out of pure commercial enterprise.
This trail was the first major international trade route to run through the newly acquired lands and into former Spanish territory. The Spanish Barrier. For centuries, Spain had strictly forbidden any commerce between its northern province of New Mexico and the United States. Trade was considered an act of smuggling, and any American found deep in Spanish territory was usually imprisoned, as explorer Zebulon Pike had been in 1807. The opportunity. In 1821, Mexico won its independence from Spain, and the new Mexican government immediately reversed the long-standing prohibition on trade. The route. The Santa Fe Trail ran approximately 900 miles from Independence, Missouri, the jumping-off point for the West, southwest through the prairies and deserts to Santa Fe, New Mexico. The trade. American traders, realizing that Santa Fe's remote Mexican population lacked basic manufactured goods, began hauling wagon loads of cheap cloth, tools, hardware, and small luxury items. They exchanged these for high-demand goods like Mexican silver pesos, mules, and furs. The profit margins were astounding, often 1,000% on a single trip, despite the immense danger from hostile tribes and the harsh environment. The legacy. The Santa Fe Trail was the first conduit for sustained cultural exchange between Anglo-Americans and Hispanic peoples in the Southwest. It laid the foundation for future military action and ultimately the American annexation of New Mexico and the Southwest during the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848. This commercial penetration weakened Mexican control and prepared the local economy for integration into the U.S. The Oregon Trail, the Great Migration, 1841 to 1869. If the Santa Fe Trail was about commerce, the Oregon Trail was about migration and the establishment of an American presence on the Pacific coast, which was still claimed by Great Britain in what was called the Oregon Country. The success of the Lewis and Clark journey fueled the notion that the U.S. was meant to control the entire region. The journey. Beginning in the 1840s, tens of thousands of settlers embarked on the grueling journey. The route spanned roughly 2,000 miles from Missouri to the Willamette Valley in what is now Oregon. The journey took between 4 and 6 months of continuous travel. The wagons and logistics. Settlers traveled in long wagon trains, often under strict military discipline. Their wagons were not meant to ride in, but were essentially large freight containers. Travelers walked almost the entire distance. The toll. The trail was a massive natural selection event. While attacks by Native Americans were relatively rare compared to later myths, the primary killers were disease, especially cholera, dysentery, and typhus. Accidents, drownings at river crossings were being crushed by wagons, and starvation. Historians estimate that 1 in 10 migrants died on the trail, leading to approximately 20,000 deaths over 3 decades. The trail was famously littered with abandoned belongings and graves. The political outcome. The massive influx of American settlers into the Oregon Country created a demographic reality that rendered the British claim unsustainable. This pressure led to the 1846 agreement with Great Britain, which peacefully established the 49th parallel as the border between the U.S. and Canada, finally solidifying the American border from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The unstoppable force, the Sioux, and the Plains tribes. The Louisiana Purchase, combined with the trails and the doctrine of manifest destiny, brought Americans into direct, permanent conflict with the powerful Native American nations of the Great Plains, most notably the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota Sioux, the Cheyenne, and the Comanche. Lewis and Clark had encountered the Sioux on the upper Missouri River, noting their strength and their strategic location. As American settlement intensified, the Plains tribes found their way of life, based on the seasonal migration of the bison, under a sustained existential threat. Treaty violations. The U.S. government repeatedly signed treaties like the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, promising safe passage and establishing boundaries for tribal lands, only to violate those boundaries as gold was discovered or as pressure from land-hungry settlers mounted. The railroad and the bison. The subsequent construction of the Transcontinental Railroad following the purchase's latitude was a death knell for the Plains tribes. The railroads were built directly across key hunting grounds. Furthermore, American hunters, often encouraged by the government and railroad companies, began the systematic slaughter of the bison, buffalo, to clear the way for cattle ranchers and deprive the tribes of their essential food source, shelter, and cultural foundation. The herds, which once numbered in the tens of millions, were nearly eradicated by the 1880s. The decades following the Louisiana Purchase became a relentless period of warfare, from the Sioux Wars to the Comanche Wars, culminating in the final tragic massacres like Wounded Knee, 1890. The purchase was a gift of land that came with the brutal responsibility of conquest. The man who bought a mountain. The story of the Louisiana Purchase is the story of America's pivot to becoming a global power. A few key facts summarize the astonishing transformation. The bargain. The $10 to $12 million price tag was a financial impossibility that only European capital could facilitate, ironically using money that helped Napoleon wage war against the British. The catalyst. The purchase set the constitutional and territorial precedents for virtually all later American expansion, including the annexations of Florida, Texas, and the Southwest. The new American identity. The exploration by Lewis and Clark and the trials of the Oregon and Santa Fe trails created the enduring myths of the American frontier, myths of self-reliance, rugged individualism, and democratic opportunity that define the nation's character to this day. The purchase was not just a geographic transaction, it was a fundamental redefinition of the American Republic, expanding its physical reach and forever complicating its moral and political future with the issues of slavery, conquest, and democratic governance. The Ghost Fleet's gold had successfully purchased the single largest, cheapest, and most consequential piece of real estate in history.
The final cost and the enduring legacy. The Louisiana Purchase, sealed with European debt and secured by Western blood, continued to shake the United States long after the trails were worn smooth and the territories admitted as states. The final cost of the purchase wasn't just measured in acres or dollars, but in the political, moral, and economic divisions it exacerbated, leading inexorably to the ultimate test of the Union, the Civil War. The slavery question, a line drawn in the sand. The immediate and most corrosive consequence of the massive territorial acquisition was the fierce debate over slavery. Would the new territories be free or slave? The political balance between slave and free states in the Senate was precarious, and the addition of even one state could tip the scales of national power. The Missouri Crisis, 1819 to 1821. When the territory of Missouri, carved from the Louisiana Purchase, applied for statehood as a slave state, it ignited the first major national crisis over slavery. Northern congressmen vehemently opposed the move, fearing it would establish a dangerous precedent for the rest of the purchase. The Missouri Compromise, 1820, engineered by Henry Clay, this agreement was a temporary solution that became a fixed line in the American psyche. It dictated three main points. Missouri would be admitted as a slave state. Maine, carved from Massachusetts, would be admitted as a free state, maintaining the Senate balance, 12 free, 12 slave. A geographic line was established. Slavery would be forever prohibited in the rest of the Louisiana Purchase north of the 36-degree 30-minute parallel, except for Missouri itself.
This compromise proved the foresight of the Federalist opponents of the purchase. They had correctly predicted that governing such a massive territory would force the nation to confront the issue of slavery head-on. The line of 36° 30' became a symbolic and literal boundary, confirming that the vast lands bought from Napoleon were the literal and ideological battleground upon which the question of American identity was ultimately fought and decided, ensuring that the legacy of the Ghost Fleet would remain the most astonishing and complex chapter in the nation's history.
The Machine Age meets the Untamed West. The vast, raw territory of the Louisiana Purchase was not conquered solely by pioneer courage. It was fundamentally shaped and exploited by the early technological revolutions of the 19th century. From 1820 to 1860, three primary innovations, the steamboat, the telegraph, and the evolving firearms, acted as the engine of manifest destiny, dramatically speeding up settlement and consolidating American power. The steamboat, conquering the current. Before the steamboat, the Mississippi River was a one-way artery. Flatboats and barges could float cargo downstream to New Orleans easily, but returning upstream against the powerful current was arduous and incredibly slow, often requiring weeks of back-breaking labor by crewmen pulling ropes from the shore, called cordelling. This limitation kept the Western economy fragmented and slow. Robert Fulton's New Orleans. In 1811, just 8 years after the purchase, Robert Fulton and Robert Livingston, the same diplomat who negotiated the purchase, launched the New Orleans, the first commercial steamboat on the Mississippi River. The technological leap. The steamboat replaced muscle power with steam power, allowing large amounts of cargo to move upstream swiftly and cheaply. A journey from New Orleans to St. Louis that once took 3 months could be completed in 10 days. Economic revolution. The steamboat instantly democratized the movement of goods and people. Farmers and merchants throughout the Ohio and Mississippi valleys could now reliably send their products south and receive manufactured goods in return. This created a unified, interconnected market for the first time, turning the Purchase's rivers into the commercial highways of the nation. The floating palaces. By the 1840s and 1850s, steamboats became extravagant floating palaces, essential not just for freight, cotton, corn, lumber, but also for passengers, often featuring opulent dining halls and gambling saloons. These boats created a new American culture of rapid mobility and risk, but they were also notoriously dangerous. Astonishing fact, the explosive danger. Early steamboats often operated with incredibly high-pressure boilers to achieve maximum speed. The regulatory environment was non-existent, leading to frequent and catastrophic boiler explosions. It is estimated that thousands of lives were lost in steamboat explosions and sinkings on the Mississippi and its tributaries between 1810 and 1850, making it one of the most dangerous forms of travel in American history. The telegraph, instantaneous communication. The vastness of the Louisiana Purchase territory posed a fundamental governance problem. Communication with Washington, D.C. was painfully slow. News from California, for instance, could take months to arrive. This distance bred distrust, autonomy, and occasionally secessionist movements, like Burr's. Samuel Morse's invention. The invention and rapid deployment of the electric telegraph in the 1840s fundamentally changed this dynamic. Speed of governance. Suddenly, the President and Congress could send directives and receive immediate reports from remote territorial capitals. This allowed the centralized federal government to exert much tighter control over distant governors, army commanders, and Indian agents. The time delay that once protected local autonomy disappeared. Consolidating commerce.
The telegraph allowed banks and commodity traders in New York and Chicago to receive instant updates on prices and crop yields in New Orleans or St. Louis. This ability to make real-time decisions cemented the financial dominance of the eastern cities over the rapidly growing Western economy. The steamboat had physically shrunk the American distance. The telegraph politically and economically abolished it, knitting the vast, scattered territories of the Purchase into a single, functional nation, even as it sped up the sectional conflict. The revolver, the great equalizer. The vast open spaces of the Purchase required a new kind of weaponry for defense, hunting, and conflict. The single-shot musket was slow and cumbersome, unsuitable for the rough-and-tumble frontier where multiple attackers or sudden danger were common. Samuel Colt's patent in 1836, the mass production of the reliable Colt revolver, revolutionized warfare and personal defense in the West. Technological superiority. The revolver allowed a rider to carry 6 shots ready to fire without reloading. This instant multi-shot capability was a massive psychological and tactical advantage over traditional bows, arrows, and single-shot rifles, particularly in encounters with hostile forces or in quick-draw duels. The Texas Rangers and expansion. The revolver found its first wide application in the Mexican-American War and among the Texas Rangers, who used the Colt-Patterson model to fight the formidable Comanche tribes. It was often referred to as the Great Equalizer, as it gave a single individual the ability to hold off multiple attackers. The steamboat, the telegraph, and the revolver were all in different ways instruments of control. They accelerated the exploitation of the Purchase's resources, subjugated the indigenous population, and ensured that the economic and political center of gravity remained firmly in the East, even as the country expanded westward.
Clash of codes: civil law versus common law. The transfer of the Louisiana Territory from France to the United States was not merely a geographic or political shift, it was a profound legal collision. The existing inhabitants of the territory, especially in the crucial city of New Orleans and the surrounding parishes, lived under a system rooted in French and Spanish traditions, civil law. The incoming Americans, however, were intent on imposing their own system, based on English precedent, common law. This legal conflict was one of the most astonishing and complex consequences of the Purchase, requiring a painful and unprecedented synthesis that continues to define Louisiana's unique legal status today. The 2 pillars of Western law. Civil law, the French-Spanish system. Basis, codified statutes and regulations, historically derived from Roman law, specifically Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis. Authority. The primary source of law is a written code. Judges apply the code to the facts of the case. They do not create binding legal precedents. Property and family. Clear distinctions were made between public and private property. Family law often featured community property between spouses. Status of slaves and free people of color. As discussed earlier, the civil law tradition, Code Noir, in Louisiana, while harsh, recognized a defined status for gens de couleur libre and allowed for easier manumission, or release from slavery. Common law, the Anglo-American system. Basis, judicial decisions that establish precedents, stare decisis. Authority. The primary source of law is past judicial rulings. Judges create law through interpretation and precedent. Property and family. Emphasis on individual ownership and different rules regarding marital property. Status of slaves and free people of color. Generally led to the creation of rigid statutory systems that viewed slaves solely as chattel, or property, and severely restricted the rights and movement of free black individuals. The battle for the bench.
Governor William Claiborne, the American administrator, was tasked with incorporating the territory, but he arrived with a complete distrust of the existing system. Initial attempts at imposition. Claiborne immediately tried to replace the Spanish-French system with the American common law model, including the introduction of the habeas corpus principle and the trial by jury in civil cases. Creole resistance. The established Creole population, particularly the powerful French-speaking lawyers and landowners, were outraged. They petitioned President Jefferson, arguing that their ancient laws and customs, which governed their property, debts, and family estates, were being arbitrarily abolished. They argued that American law was alien, unpredictable, and incomprehensible to them. The resistance was so fierce that Congress was forced to step back from a full legal revolution. In 1806, President Jefferson conceded that the territory's inhabitants were entitled to the benefits of trial by jury and to the writ of habeas corpus, but that the laws respecting their property would largely remain intact, respecting the Spanish and French codes. The unprecedented synthesis. The Louisiana Civil Code of 1808 and its revisions in 1825. The necessity of bridging these two legal worlds led to the creation of a document unique in American jurisprudence, the Louisiana Civil Code of 1808 and its revisions in 1825. The hybrid system. Louisiana's legislature commissioned two brilliant legal minds, James Brown and Louis Moreau-Lislay, to codify the existing French and Spanish civil laws. However, because the primary framers were also steeped in the common law tradition, they subtly incorporated many common law concepts into the code. The result? Louisiana became the only U.S. state, except for some aspects of New Mexico's land laws, to base its core property, contract, and family law on the civil law tradition. The Great Divide. Private law, in areas like marriage, divorce, and succession, inheritance, Louisiana remains fundamentally civil law. Public law, in areas like criminal procedure, constitutional law, and evidence, Louisiana follows the American common law system. Astonishing legal fact. Because Louisiana property law is based on civil law, it includes the concept of usufruct, the right to enjoy the use and benefits of property belonging to another, short of destroying or wasting it, and community property laws that are distinctly different from the other 49 states. This distinction required Supreme Court rulings to acknowledge that the Louisiana Purchase had created a unique legal anomaly within the federal system. The philosophical fallout. Land ownership. The legal clash extended into the very concept of land ownership. The American system prioritized rapid, clear privatization and sale of land, fueling speculation and settlement. The Spanish and French systems, however, often involved complex, overlapping claims, communal rights, and grants that were vaguely defined, often relying on natural features like a certain creek or to the oak tree. The U.S. Congress spent decades unraveling and confirming these old, overlapping land claims across the purchased territory, creating a legal and administrative nightmare. The problem of the commons. In many territories, especially around New Orleans, Spanish land grants included communal areas, or commons, for grazing and public use. American settlers and speculators often ignored these, attempting to privatize the land, leading to bitter local disputes and lawsuits that lasted generations. The Spanish archives. The U.S. government had to rely on the chaotic, often incomplete Spanish and French archives inherited after the transfer to confirm titles in states like Missouri, Arkansas, and Louisiana. The legal incorporation of the Louisiana Purchase was therefore not a simple transfer, but a forced marriage of two legal philosophies, creating an incredibly rich, complex, and often litigious history for the American West.
The phantom boundaries in the West Florida Rebellion. The Louisiana Purchase may have doubled America's size, but it failed to provide any clear limits. Napoleon sold the territory to the U.S. without defining its eastern, western, or southern boundaries.
The resulting ambiguity plunged the United States into 2 decades of tense diplomatic standoffs, espionage, and near war with Spain. The problem of the vague deed. The treaty stated that the U.S. acquired Louisiana with the same extent that it now has in the hands of Spain and that it had when France possessed it. This vague wording was diplomatic chaos, as neither France nor Spain had ever agreed on the exact borders, and the area had changed hands twice in 40 years. The East Boundary Dispute, West Florida. Jefferson immediately claimed that the purchase included West Florida, the coastal strip between the Mississippi River and the Perdido River, including Mobile and Biloxi. The American logic. France had claimed this area when it previously owned Louisiana. The Spanish reality. Spain had clearly administered this strip as part of its Florida colony, not Louisiana, for decades. The stakes. This land was vital, as it included several major ports crucial for American trade and military movement. The West Boundary Dispute, Texas. Spain claimed the purchase's western boundary ended abruptly at the Arroyo Hondo, just west of the Red River in modern Louisiana. The U.S. argued the territory extended all the way to the Rio Grande in modern Texas. The West Florida grab in 1810. The diplomatic deadlock over West Florida reached a breaking point in 1810. The American settlers who had poured into the disputed territory grew tired of ineffective Spanish rule and American ambiguity. The rebellion. Inspired by manifest destiny and a desire for stability, American residents in West Florida staged a minor revolt, seized the Spanish fort at Baton Rouge, and declared the Republic of West Florida. They even designed a flag, a single white star on a blue field, the Lone Star design, later adopted by Texas. The annexation. President James Madison, acting decisively to end the chaos, quickly declared that the area was officially part of the Louisiana Purchase and ordered Governor Claiborne to annex the territory into the U.S. This was done without Spain's consent, essentially a bloodless land grab justified by the vague wording of the 1803 treaty. This aggressive move demonstrated that the U.S. was willing to interpret the Louisiana Purchase unilaterally, setting a dangerous precedent for future land acquisition. The Transcontinental Treaty and the End of Spain, 1819. The ongoing chaos along the Spanish borders, particularly in East Florida where Seminole raids were frequent, forced Spain and the U.S. back to the negotiating table. President James Monroe tasked Secretary of State John Quincy Adams to resolve the matter. Adams faced off against Spanish Minister Luis de Onís in tense negotiations. Spain was weak, its American empire crumbling, and it desperately needed to settle the lingering disputes. The result was the Adams-Onís Treaty, also known as the Transcontinental Treaty of 1819, a masterpiece of American diplomacy. Florida acquisition. Spain ceded all of East Florida, the peninsula, to the U.S. Western boundary defined. The U.S. finally relinquished its vague claim to Texas, and in exchange, Spain definitively set the western boundary of the Louisiana Purchase along a clear negotiated line that ran north and west to the Pacific Ocean, north of the 42nd parallel. This line secured the U.S. claim to the future states of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. The payment. The U.S. did not directly pay Spain for Florida. Instead, the U.S. agreed to assume the claims of American citizens against the Spanish government up to $5 million. The Louisiana Purchase's boundaries were finally, formally settled. The $15 million purchase price had, effectively, secured not just the Mississippi Valley, but also paved the way for the acquisition of the entire southeastern and northwestern portions of the continent. The inevitable sequel, war with Mexico. With the borders of the Louisiana Purchase finally defined, the U.S. turned its hungry gaze towards its new southern and western neighbor, Mexico, which gained independence from Spain in 1821. The acquisition of Louisiana had given the U.S. a massive border with the Mexican province of Texas and provided the geographic springboard for American expansion into the entire Southwest. American settlement of Texas. Mexico, needing economic development and a buffer against raiding Native American tribes, encouraged American settlement in Texas under impresarios like Stephen Austin. Settlers agreed to become Mexican citizens, convert to Catholicism, and obey Mexican law, including the abolition of slavery. The break. By the 1830s, American settlers far outnumbered the Mexican population in Texas. They largely ignored Mexican law, refused to abandon slavery, and chafed under Mexican rule. The American hunger for land and the sense of American racial and cultural superiority, fueled by manifest destiny, made conflict inevitable. The annexation of Texas in 1845.
After the Texas Revolution, 1836, the U.S. finally annexed the independent Republic of Texas, immediately triggering a diplomatic breakdown with Mexico, which considered the annexation an act of war. The Mexican-American War in 1846 to 1848. President James K. Polk, a staunch expansionist, deliberately provoked a conflict with Mexico to acquire California and New Mexico. The resulting war led to a decisive American victory, the final triumph of the Purchase. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 concluded the war. The U.S. paid Mexico $15 million, the exact price of the Louisiana Purchase, for the vast territory known as the Mexican Cession, including California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. The Louisiana Purchase was the catalyst for this final, massive acquisition. By establishing the U.S. as a continental power, it set the nation on an irreversible path of expansion, ultimately achieving the dream of a nation stretching from sea to shining sea.
The untold story of the Transcontinental Railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad was not just the greatest engineering feat of 19th century America, it was a brutal, corrupt, and transformative project that permanently changed the physical, economic, and cultural landscape of the Louisiana Purchase territory and the entire West. It fundamentally answered the question of how to connect the vast empire Jefferson had purchased. The political will and the financial scandal. The idea of a railroad linking the East and West coasts had been a dream since the 1830s, but it took the urgency of the Civil War to make it a reality. With the Southern states having seceded, Congress was finally able to pass the Pacific Railroad Acts of 1862 and 1864 without sectional opposition. The companies. The project was split between two primary companies. The Union Pacific Railroad, building westward from Omaha, Nebraska, deep within the Louisiana Purchase territory, and the Central Pacific Railroad, building eastward from Sacramento, California. The bribe of land. To encourage investment in this massive, risky undertaking, the U.S. government offered extraordinary subsidies. The railroad companies received 10 square miles of public land for every mile of track laid, essentially turning the railroads into the largest private landowners in the West. This land was not just used for the tracks, it was sold to settlers, creating the towns and economies along the line. The financial scandal, Credit Mobilier. The construction was riddled with corruption. The Union Pacific directors created a fraudulent construction company called Credit Mobilier. They awarded themselves lucrative, overpriced contracts to build the railroad, then systematically bribed congressmen and political officials with stock in the scheme to ensure continued funding and political protection. The scandal broke in 1872, exposing widespread corruption at the highest levels of the U.S. government and becoming the most significant symbol of Gilded Age corporate greed. The human cost and the technological nightmare. The construction of the railroad was a logistical and physical challenge met through the exploitation of two distinct immigrant labor forces, the Irish and the Chinese. The Union Pacific and the Irish. The Union Pacific workforce was largely composed of Irish immigrants and Civil War veterans, both Union and Confederate. The hell on wheels, construction crews were followed by makeshift, chaotic tent towns known as Hell on Wheels. These settlements were mobile centers of gambling, saloons, and prostitution, springing up suddenly and moving every few weeks with the advancing railhead. This environment was marked by immense violence, disease, and lawlessness. Speed over safety. The goal of the Union Pacific was to lay track as fast as possible to maximize government subsidies. Work was rushed, often leading to accidents, and payment was intermittent. The Central Pacific and the Chinese. The Central Pacific faced the monumental task of blasting through the rugged Sierra Nevada mountains. After facing severe labor shortages, they began hiring thousands of Chinese laborers, known as coolies. Their conditions: Chinese workers were paid less than their white counterparts and faced constant racial discrimination. Their work was the most dangerous, blasting tunnels through solid granite.
They were often lowered down cliffs in wicker baskets to set charges. Dynamite and nitroglycerin accidents were common, and historians estimate that over 1,200 Chinese laborers died during the Central Pacific's construction, though the exact number remains officially unknown due to poor record-keeping. The end of the bison and the tribes. The most devastating impact of the railroad was on the environment and the Native American tribes of the Great Plains, whose way of life was inextricably linked to the bison. The slicing of the plains. The railroad tracks cut right across the traditional migratory routes of the massive bison herds. This alone disrupted the hunting patterns of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Comanche. Systematic slaughter. Railroad companies hired professional hunters, most famously Buffalo Bill Cody, to kill bison, both to feed the large construction crews and, more strategically, to clear the herds from the tracks and weaken the Native American resistance. The U.S. government tacitly supported this, viewing the destruction of the bison as the fastest way to subjugate the Plains tribes. The Golden Spike, a new era. On May 10, 1869, at Promontory Summit, Utah, the Union Pacific and Central Pacific lines finally met. The famous Golden Spike was ceremoniously driven, marking the physical completion of the world's first transcontinental railroad. The railroad instantly unified the nation's economy, collapsing travel time from months to days and accelerating the settlement of the West beyond imagination. It was the final brutal realization of the continental empire Thomas Jefferson had only dared to purchase.
The transcontinental ripple effect. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 did more than just connect 2 points on a map. It created a unified national economy, standardized life across the continent, and gave rise to entirely new industries that defined the late 19th century American West. The rise of the cattle kingdom. The railroad was the literal engine of the American cattle kingdom. Before 1869, the vast herds of longhorn cattle roaming Texas were almost worthless because there was no cost-effective way to get them to the densely populated eastern markets. The problem solved. The railroad provided the solution. Cow towns like Abilene and Dodge City in Kansas sprang up along the Union Pacific line, serving as the northern endpoints of the famous cattle drives like the Chisholm Trail. The economics. Cowboys would drive herds of thousands of cattle, often for months, north from Texas. At the railheads, the cattle were sold, loaded onto trains, often in horrifically crowded conditions, and shipped rapidly to slaughterhouses in Chicago, the hog butcher for the world, and distribution points further east. A new American archetype. This era, though brief, roughly 1866 to 1885, created the iconic image of the American cowboy. However, the reality was often far from the myth. Cowboys were a diverse group, including Mexican vaqueros, black cattle hands, and poor white laborers, all working for meager wages and living under extremely harsh conditions. Standardizing time, the need for uniformity. The railroad created a logistical nightmare that led to a revolutionary concept, standard time zones. Before the railroad, nearly every town in the U.S. set its clock based on the local solar noon, when the sun was highest. This meant that when it was 12 p.m. in New York, it might be 12:08 p.m. in Philadelphia and 11:54 a.m. in Washington, D.C. This local variation was manageable when travel was slow. The chaos of schedules. With trains traveling hundreds of miles per day, this lack of standardized time led to massive confusion and dangerous errors in scheduling. Two trains traveling on the same track needed perfect coordination to avoid head-on collisions, and scheduling based on dozens of local times became impossible. The railroad solution. On November 18, 1883, known as the Day of Two Noons. Without any federal legislation, the major American and Canadian railroad companies unilaterally implemented 4 standard time zones across North America. Every railroad clock was synchronized. The public adoption, although local communities resisted at first, preferring the sun to determine their time, the convenience and power of the railroad eventually forced the public to adopt the new system. It wasn't until 1918 that Congress officially adopted the standard time zones, but the railroads had already imposed order on the nation's clocks. Mail order and the end of isolation. The railroad was also the primary driver of the retail revolution that connected rural Americans in the Louisiana Purchase territory with the goods and fashions of the East. The problem: frontier life was defined by isolation and limited access to manufactured goods. Rural settlers had to rely on local, expensive general stores or wait for months for goods shipped by wagon. The solution: mail order. Companies like Montgomery Ward, established 1872, and Sears, Roebuck & Co., established 1893, recognized that the railroad and the newly established Rural Free Delivery Postal Service could bypass the local merchant. The Wish Book. They produced massive illustrated catalogs known as the Wish Book that were mailed directly to remote farms. Settlers could order anything from farm equipment and clothing to pianos and even prefabricated houses, and have them delivered quickly and relatively cheaply via the rail network. Cultural unification. This system provided access to a uniform supply of goods, bringing urban styles and commodities to the most remote corners of the West. It played a significant role in homogenizing American consumer culture and cementing the economic dependence of the West on Eastern industry. The Transcontinental Railroad did more than just span the continent. It literally restructured American time, economy, and society, setting the stage for the industrial superpower of the 20th century. Collis Potter Huntington and the Architects of Avarice. The Transcontinental Railroad was not built by governments. It was built by private capital, driven by men known as the Big Four, 4 ruthless entrepreneurs who controlled the Central Pacific Railroad. Among them, Collis Potter Huntington, 1821 to 1900, stands out as the ultimate political manipulator and financial engine of the Western rail expansion. The partnership and the political machine. Huntington, along with Leland Stanford, the public face and later governor of California, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker, formed the Central Pacific's controlling syndicate. Their strategy was simple: secure massive government subsidies, monopolize all transportation in California, and then use political influence to protect their empire. The Sacramento Shopkeeper. Huntington started as a hardware merchant in Sacramento during the gold rush. He quickly realized that the biggest profits weren't in finding gold, but in controlling the supply chain, a lesson he applied perfectly to the railroad. The Lobbyist-in-Chief. Huntington relocated to Washington, D.C., where he became the Central Pacific's sole and highly effective lobbyist. He ran a private political machine from a lavish suite at the Arlington Hotel, essentially making the U.S. Congress a subsidiary of his railroad. His methods included direct bribery, ensuring the Pacific Railroad Acts gave the Central Pacific the maximum possible land grants and financial incentives, political manipulation, finding friendly politicians and crushing rivals. He famously said, "If you have to go to court, you've lost. If you can get legislation, you win." The land empire and the public debt. The sheer scale of the wealth accumulated by Huntington and the Big Four is astonishing. The subsidies they received were staggering. Federal loans, $25,000 to $48,000 in federal bonds for every mile of track laid, depending on the terrain. Land grants, millions of acres of prime public land given outright. Huntington's financial genius lay in using the government's own money and land to build the railroad, making himself and his partners fabulously wealthy while placing the financial risk squarely on the American taxpayer. Monopoly power. Once the tracks were laid, Huntington ruthlessly enforced a monopoly across California and Nevada, charging exorbitant freight rates that crippled farmers and small businesses. He dictated the economic life of the entire region. The unpaid debt. The government loans were meant to be repaid. For decades, Huntington used his political leverage to resist paying the massive outstanding debt owed by the Central Pacific to the U.S. Treasury, leading to intense public outrage and the creation of anti-monopoly movements in the West. The irony of the South. The Chesapeake and Ohio line. After completing the Transcontinental Railroad, Huntington turned his ambition eastward. He acquired and expanded the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway, aiming to connect the rich coal fields of West Virginia and Kentucky with the Atlantic coast. A personal empire. He virtually owned the entire town of Huntington, West Virginia, which he named after himself, making it a key terminus for his rail lines and river transport systems. The shipping conglomerate. To complement his rail empire, Huntington also became a major force in transatlantic shipping, creating the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company. He was one of the few tycoons who controlled the movement of goods from the mine or farm all the way to foreign markets. Huntington's career exemplifies the paradox of the Gilded Age. He was a brilliant visionary who physically unified the nation and made the settlement of the Louisiana Purchase possible. Yet he did so through systematic corruption, monopolistic practices, and contempt for the public good. His legacy is one of progress built on plunder.
The Gilded Age, the rise of the American industrial tycoons. The period between the end of the Civil War, 1865, and the turn of the 20th century is known as the Gilded Age, a term coined by Mark Twain, suggesting that while American society looked dazzling and prosperous on the surface, it concealed vast social problems and staggering corruption underneath. This era was defined by a small group of industrial tycoons, often called robber barons by critics, or captains of industry by admirers, who amassed wealth and power never before seen in world history. The Titans and their industries. The foundation of the Gilded Age economy was laid by technological leaps like the Bessemer process for steel and the harnessing of oil, and the ruthlessness of a few key individuals who sought not just profit, but monopoly control over their respective industries. Andrew Carnegie and steel. The industry. Steel became the essential material for the transcontinental railroads, skyscrapers, and modern machinery. The strategy. Vertical integration. Andrew Carnegie, 1835 to 1919, an immigrant from Scotland, perfected the concept of vertical integration. He sought to control every step of the steel production process, from the initial mining of iron ore in the Mesabi Range to the shipping and rail transport to the production of the finished steel product at his massive mills near Pittsburgh. This strategy eliminated middlemen, allowed him to slash production costs, and undercut all competitors, ensuring that his company, Carnegie Steel, achieved a dominant near-monopolistic position. The philanthropist. After selling Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan for over $400 million, making him the richest man in the world, Carnegie devoted his life to philanthropy, espousing the gospel of wealth. He famously stated that the man who dies rich dies disgraced.
He funded the building of over 2,500 public libraries and founded Carnegie Mellon University, leaving a contradictory legacy of ruthless capitalism followed by monumental charity. John D. Rockefeller and oil. The industry. Oil, initially used primarily for kerosene lighting, was the essential fuel of the age. The strategy, horizontal integration, and the trust. John D. Rockefeller aimed for a complete monopoly in oil refining. He employed horizontal integration, buying out competing refineries. To bypass anti-monopoly laws, he pioneered the use of the trust, where stockholders of various competing companies turned their shares over to a group of trustees who then managed all the companies as one giant entity, effectively creating a monopoly called Standard Oil. Controlling transport. Rockefeller used his immense volume to demand illegal rebates or discounts from the railroads, like those built by Huntington, often getting paid to ship his oil, while his competitors had to pay full price, driving them into bankruptcy. At its peak, Standard Oil controlled over 90% of all oil refining in the U.S. J.P. Morgan and finance. The industry. Banking and finance, the capital that funded all other industries. The strategy, interlocking directorates. J.P. Morgan was the dominant figure on Wall Street. He didn't build railroads or drill for oil. He consolidated and controlled the companies that did. He used his vast financial power to restructure and save bankrupt railroads, like many built by the Big Four, placing his own men on the boards of directors of these companies, a practice called interlocking directorates. The power broker. Morgan's power was so immense that he personally bailed out the U.S. Treasury during the Panic of 1893. In 1901, he brokered the deal to buy Carnegie Steel, merging it with other firms to create U.S. Steel, the world's first billion-dollar corporation. The social and political fallout. The stunning concentration of wealth created a dark counterpart, widespread poverty, dangerous working conditions, and the rise of powerful labor movements. The labor wars. The Gilded Age saw violent clashes between capital and labor. Tycoons fiercely resisted unions, using private security forces, like the Pinkerton Detective Agency, and government troops to crush strikes, most famously during the Homestead Strike, 1892, at Carnegie Steel Mill. Urbanization and inequality. Millions of immigrants flocked to American cities to work in factories, living in cramped, unsanitary tenements. While the tycoons lived in unprecedented luxury, building massive mansions on Millionaires' Row, their workers faced grueling 12-hour shifts for low wages, leading to extreme social tension. The beginning of antitrust. The public outrage over monopolies and corruption, epitomized by Standard Oil, finally spurred Congress to action. The passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act, 1890, was the first major legislative attempt to limit corporate power and dissolve monopolies, although it was largely ineffective until the Progressive Era. The Gilded Age created the foundation of America's economic power, but also forced the nation to confront the fundamental conflict between laissez-faire capitalism and democratic ideals. The Progressive Era and the taming of the Titans. The excesses of the Gilded Age, the monopolies, the brutal labor conditions, and the political corruption fueled a powerful, diverse, and sustained reform movement known as the Progressive Era, roughly 1890s to 1920s. Progressives were not socialists. They were middle-class reformers who believed that government and science could be used to regulate capitalism and ensure a fairer, healthier society without overthrowing the economic system. The muckrakers, exposing the underbelly. The first weapon of the progressives was investigative journalism, leading to the rise of the muckrakers, a term coined by Theodore Roosevelt. These writers used detailed reporting to expose corporate malfeasance and social ills, forcing the public and government to pay attention. Ida Tarbell and Standard Oil. Ida Tarbell, 1857 to 1944, published The History of the Standard Oil Company, 1904. Her exhaustive, fact-based exposé revealed John Rockefeller's ruthless, unethical, and often illegal tactics to destroy competitors and achieve his monopoly. The popular outrage generated by her work directly fueled the U.S. government's successful antitrust case against Standard Oil. Upton Sinclair and Meatpacking. Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle, 1906, though fictional, was based on extensive research into the horrific working conditions and unsanitary practices of the Chicago meatpacking industry. While Sinclair intended to advocate for socialism, the public was primarily horrified by the description of spoiled meat and rats being processed into food. This led to immediate, sweeping federal regulation. Theodore Roosevelt, the Trust Buster. The true political muscle for the progressive movement came from the Oval Office, particularly under President Theodore Roosevelt, 1901 to 1909. Roosevelt was a dynamic figure who rejected the traditional Republican stance of laissez-faire, non-interference, and believed the president should be an active agent of reform. Trust busting. Roosevelt declared that there were good trusts, efficiently managed monopolies that served the public, and bad trusts, monopolies that gouged consumers. He used the largely dormant Sherman Antitrust Act, 1890, to target the bad ones. His first major victory was the dissolution of the Northern Securities Company, a railroad holding company controlled by J.P. Morgan, demonstrating that no corporation was too powerful to be challenged by the government. Consumer protection. Directly responding to the muckrakers, Roosevelt pushed for landmark consumer laws. The Meat Inspection Act, 1906, mandated federal inspection of meatpacking plants. The Pure Food and Drug Act, 1906, created the precursor to the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, prohibiting the sale of adulterated or mislabeled food and medicine. Conservation. Roosevelt was the first president to prioritize environmental protection on a large scale. He used his executive power to set aside vast tracts of Western land, much of it acquired through the Louisiana Purchase, establishing national forests, national parks, and national monuments, fundamentally changing America's relationship with its public lands. Direct democracy and social reform. Progressives worked not only through federal legislation, but also at the state and local levels to give citizens more control of government. Direct primary allowed voters, rather than party bosses, to choose candidates for general elections. Initiative, referendum, and recall gave citizens the power to propose laws, initiative, vote directly on proposed laws, referendum, and remove elected officials from office, recall. Constitutional amendments. The Progressive era saw 4 key amendments passed that fundamentally altered the structure of American democracy. 16th Amendment, 1913, authorized a federal income tax, providing the government with the necessary revenue to fund its new regulatory roles. 17th Amendment, 1913, allowed for the direct popular election of U.S. senators, previously chosen by state legislatures. Direct democracy and social reform continued. The Progressive era continued its drive for reform through further constitutional changes and powerful social movements. 18th Amendment, 1919, established prohibition, banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. This was the culmination of decades of effort by temperance groups who argued that alcohol caused poverty, crime, and domestic violence, primarily affecting the urban working class. This act was often driven by a moralistic impulse of the middle-class progressives. 19th Amendment, 1920, granted women the right to vote, suffrage. This amendment was the result of over 70 years of relentless effort by figures like Susan Anthony and Alice Paul. The progressive belief in expanding democracy to counter political corruption provided the final momentum needed for this landmark change. Social uplift and regulation. Progressives also targeted social and labor issues that affected the most vulnerable populations. Child labor. Reformers worked tirelessly to expose the cruel reality of children working in factories and mines, often for long hours in dangerous conditions. Figures like Florence Kelley successfully lobbied state and federal governments to pass minimum age laws and maximum hour laws for children, though national regulation faced strong constitutional challenges initially. Settlement houses. Social workers like Jane Addams established settlement houses, most famously Hull House in Chicago, in immigrant and working-class neighborhoods. These served as community centers offering daycare, education, healthcare, and job training, aiming to bridge the gap between the affluent and the impoverished industrial workers. Workplace safety. Tragedies like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911 in New York City, where 146 garment workers died due to locked doors and poor safety standards, galvanized public opinion. This event directly led to the passing of new, stricter factory inspection laws and fire codes at the state level. The Progressive Era effectively ended the unchecked dominance of the Gilded Age tycoons by creating a framework of government regulation. It proved that a democracy could adapt to the industrial age, asserting the power of the federal government to protect consumers, workers, and the environment.
The Reluctant Giant and the Treaty of Versailles. World War I, 1914 to 1918, was a watershed moment that marked the end of the 19th century optimism and the birth of the modern, turbulent 20th century. For the United States, it was a pivotal shift from a policy of isolationism to becoming a global superpower. American neutrality and the sinking of the Lusitania. When war broke out in Europe in August 1914, President Woodrow Wilson immediately declared a policy of strict neutrality. The American public, focused on the progressive reforms and the domestic economy, had little desire to involve itself in what was viewed as an archaic European conflict over imperial claims. Economic ties. Despite official neutrality, the U.S. economy quickly became intertwined with the Allied, British and French war effort. American banks loaned vast sums of money to the Allies, and American factories supplied food, steel, and munitions. This made true neutrality nearly impossible. German submarine warfare. Germany responded to the British naval blockade by implementing unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning their U-boats would sink any vessel, military or commercial, found in the war zone around Britain. The Lusitania, May 7, 1915, the sinking of the British passenger liner Lusitania off the coast of Ireland, which resulted in the deaths of 1,198, including 128 Americans, profoundly shocked the U.S. public. Germany had warned the ship carried contraband, military goods, but the scale of the civilian loss enraged Americans and led Wilson to issue stern warnings, causing Germany to briefly scale back its submarine campaign. The final triggers for war. Despite the Lusitania disaster, Wilson successfully campaigned for re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." However, early in 1917, two events made American entry into the war inevitable. Resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare.
In February 1917, facing crippling shortages and a desperate need to cut off Allied supply lines, Germany resumed full unrestricted submarine warfare, knowing it would likely draw the U.S. into the conflict. Within weeks, U-boats sank several American merchant ships. The Zimmermann telegram. In March 1917, British intelligence intercepted and decoded a secret telegram sent from German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico. The proposition was the telegram proposed a military alliance between Germany and Mexico. If the U.S. entered the war, Mexico was promised American territories lost in the Mexican-American War, specifically Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The result, the public release of the telegram created a furious demand for war, proving to Americans that Germany posed a direct threat to the continental U.S. and the stability of the Western Hemisphere. On April 6, 1917, President Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war, stating, "The world must be made safe for democracy." America mobilizes and the end of the war. The entry of the United States was the decisive factor that tipped the balance in favor of the exhausted Allied forces. The American Expeditionary Force, or AEF, led by General John J. Blackjack Pershing, consisted of over 2 million American soldiers, known as doughboys. The U.S. military draft quickly transformed the small peacetime army into a massive fighting force. Impact on the Western Front. American troops began arriving in large numbers in 1918. Their arrival was critical, not only for their fighting prowess, but for the massive psychological boost they provided to the demoralized British and French, and the devastating blow they dealt to German morale. The final push. American forces played a decisive role in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, September through November 1918, a massive Allied push that broke the German lines and forced Germany to seek an armistice. The war concluded on November 11, 1918. Wilson's vision and the Treaty of Versailles. President Wilson arrived in Paris for the 1919 peace conference with a revolutionary vision for a peaceful future, encapsulated in his 14 points. His main goal was to establish a League of Nations to prevent future wars through collective security. The resulting Treaty of Versailles was a punishing document driven primarily by French and British demands for revenge. It included the War Guilt Clause, which forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for the war, massive reparations or payments demanded from Germany, severe limitations on the German military. The League rejected. Wilson won the creation of the League of Nations, but tragically he failed to convince his own country to join. The U.S. Senate, dominated by isolationist Republicans, refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, primarily because they feared the League of Nations would supersede the U.S. Congress's power to declare war. The U.S. retreated from the global commitment Wilson championed, but the war had irrevocably established America as the world's greatest financial and industrial power, setting the stage for its eventual dominant role in World War II.
The Roaring Twenties, Jazz, Prohibition, and Cultural Clash. The 1920s was a decade characterized by dramatic shifts in American life, often called the Jazz Age or the Roaring Twenties. It was a time of economic boom, mass consumerism, cultural liberation, and a strong conservative backlash against modernity. Economic prosperity and the consumer revolution. The decade saw unprecedented economic growth, fueled by new technologies and innovative business practices. The assembly line. Henry Ford's perfection of the assembly line revolutionized manufacturing, drastically reducing the cost and time required to produce goods, particularly the automobile. This made cars accessible to the middle class, transforming American society by creating suburbs, highways, and the entire petroleum industry.
Mass consumerism. With rising wages and new, affordable products, Americans embraced consumerism. Advertising and marketing became major industries, successfully convincing people that their happiness depended on purchasing the latest appliances, radios, and fashions. Credit and debt. A key driver of this spending was the widespread adoption of installment plans, buying on credit. Americans increasingly went into debt to maintain their new lifestyle, masking underlying instability in the economy. The stock market boom. Fueled by easy credit and speculative frenzy, the stock market experienced massive, unchecked growth. Millions of ordinary Americans began investing, often buying stocks on margin, borrowing money to purchase shares, creating a massive, speculative bubble. Cultural liberation and the new woman. The Roaring Twenties marked a fundamental break from Victorian morality, particularly for young, urban women. The flapper. The iconic symbol of the decade was the flapper. She was characterized by her short hair, short skirts, heavy makeup, and a rejection of traditional roles. Flappers smoked, drank, drove cars, and danced to jazz music, symbolizing a new freedom and self-expression. Jazz Age. The decade earned its name from the rise of jazz music, an innovative, improvisational musical form rooted in the African American experience in cities like New Orleans, Chicago, and New York, Harlem. Jazz became the soundtrack of the younger generation and represented a new level of cultural integration and appreciation for Black artistic expression, though racial segregation remained rampant. The Harlem Renaissance. This was an explosion of African American artistic, literary, and intellectual life centered in Harlem, New York. Figures like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Claude McKay used literature and art to explore Black identity, culture, and life in America, fundamentally reshaping American arts and literature.
The conservative backlash and prohibition. The rapid pace of social and cultural change provoked a strong defensive reaction from traditional and rural Americans who felt their values were being threatened. Prohibition, 18th Amendment, the passage of Prohibition in 1919 was the ultimate expression of this moral conservatism. Intended to cure society's ills, it instead created a massive black market. The rise of organized crime. Illegal liquor production and distribution became a hugely profitable enterprise, leading to the rise of powerful gangsters like Al Capone in Chicago, who built violent criminal empires based on bootlegging. Speakeasies. Illegal bars, known as speakeasies, flourished in every major city, often requiring secret passwords for entry, adding a layer of illicit excitement to the era's nightlife. Nativism and immigration. The end of WW1 triggered a wave of intense nativism, anti-immigrant sentiment. Congress passed the National Origins Act of 1924, which established strict quotas heavily favoring immigrants from Northern and Western Europe, while severely restricting those from Southern and Eastern Europe, and virtually banning Asians. This was the final closure of the open immigration policy that had defined the 19th century. The Scopes Trial, 1925. The famous Monkey Trial in Tennessee pitted modern science against religious fundamentalism. High school teacher John T. Scopes was tried for teaching the theory of evolution, which was illegal under state law. The trial became a national spectacle, highlighting the deep cultural chasm between urban, secular modernity and rural religious conservatism. The Roaring Twenties was a decade of profound tension between unprecedented wealth and underlying financial instability, between liberated social customs and strict moral policing, and between a global outlook, jazz and science, and a powerful isolationist nativist impulse. These tensions would ultimately be shattered by the economic collapse that followed. The Great Depression,
The collapse of the American dream, 1929 to 1941. The Great Depression was the deepest and longest-lasting economic downturn in the history of the Western industrialized world. It permanently shattered the optimism of the 1920s and forced the United States government to fundamentally redefine its role in the economy and in the lives of its citizens. The cracks in the facade. The prosperity of the 1920s was built on shaky foundations. Several underlying economic weaknesses made the collapse inevitable. Unequal distribution of wealth. Despite the economic boom, the vast majority of the wealth and income growth was concentrated at the top. Most American families had very little savings and could not afford to sustain the high consumer spending levels once credit dried up. Overproduction and underconsumption. American factories were producing goods, cars, appliances, at an accelerating rate due to the assembly line, but wages lagged behind. Soon, the market was saturated, and ordinary Americans could not afford to buy the goods being produced, which created a cycle of slowing production and layoffs. Agricultural crisis. Farmers had been suffering throughout the 1920s. Overproduction during World War I and declining European demand led to plunging commodity prices, forcing many farmers into foreclosure and deepening rural poverty. Unregulated banking and speculation. Banks operated with very few federal regulations, often investing depositors' money in risky ventures, including the speculative stock market. The rampant practice of buying stock on margin with borrowed money made the entire financial structure a house of cards. Black Tuesday and the spiral downward. The trigger for the collapse was the stock market crash, but it was merely a symptom of the underlying crisis. Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929, the day the stock market panic reached its peak. Millions of shares were traded in a frenzy of selling, and the market lost billions of dollars. While not the cause of the depression, the crash wiped out investor confidence and severely limited the capital available for loans and investment. The banking crisis. As businesses failed, they defaulted on loans, causing banks to fail. Crucially, there was no federal deposit insurance. When a bank failed, people lost everything. Terrified citizens rushed to withdraw their money, causing widespread bank runs that led to a cascade of further bank closures. By 1933, thousands of banks had failed. Mass unemployment. Without bank capital and consumer demand, businesses could not operate. Factories closed, leading to massive layoffs. By 1933, the unemployment rate soared to nearly 25%, meaning 1 in 4 Americans who wanted a job could not find one. Life in the abyss and the Hoover reaction. The social consequences of the Depression were catastrophic and visible across the country. Poverty and hunger. Millions of Americans lost their homes and jobs. Families relied on soup kitchens and bread lines for food. Evicted families often built shanty towns out of scrap materials on the outskirts of cities, sarcastically nicknamed Hoovervilles after the sitting president, Herbert Hoover. The Dust Bowl, 1930s. The economic disaster was compounded by an environmental one. Decades of poor farming practices, combined with severe drought, led to massive wind erosion in the Great Plains, part of the Louisiana Purchase land. Topsoil turned into dust, creating gigantic black blizzards that devastated farms across Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and other states. Thousands of displaced farm families, often called Okies, migrated west to California looking for work, only to find poverty there as well. Hoover's response. President Herbert Hoover initially believed in rugged individualism and limited government intervention. He resisted direct federal relief payments, fearing they would undermine self-reliance. His attempts to encourage voluntary cooperation between business leaders and state governments failed utterly to stem the crisis, leading to widespread disillusionment and anger.
FDR and the New Deal: Relief, Recovery, Reform. When Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, took office on March 4, 1933, America was economically shattered. The guiding principle of his administration was to take swift, bold action centered around three main goals: relief, recovery, and reform. In his first inaugural address, he famously declared, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." The first 100 days. Immediately upon taking power, FDR called Congress into a special session and quickly passed a series of laws, a period known in American history as the first 100 days. Restoring the Banking System, Emergency Banking Relief Act, 1933. Within 2 days of taking office, FDR declared a bank holiday, shutting down all banks. This stopped the panicked withdrawal of money. Only financially sound banks were then permitted to reopen under federal supervision. Restoring confidence. FDR began broadcasting regular addresses to the nation in simple language over the radio, known as fireside chats. These chats reassured the public to trust the banks again, helping to end the banking crisis and restore public confidence. Establishing the FDIC. The Federal Insurance Deposit Corporation, FDIC, was established, which provided federal insurance for bank deposits up to $5,000. This created a permanent, stable foundation for the American banking system. Employment and relief for the unemployed, relief. A major part of the New Deal was providing direct jobs and financial assistance to the unemployed. CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, 1933. This was a voluntary program for young, unmarried, unemployed men. These workers engaged in conservation efforts, planting trees, building dams, and performing flood control work. Approximately 3 million men participated, receiving room, board, and a small wage that helped support their families. WPA, Works Progress Administration, 1935. The largest employment agency of the New Deal, the WPA gave jobs to about 8.5 million people. The WPA not only built roads and bridges, but also employed artists, writers, and musicians for public art, historical guides, and theater projects. TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, 1933. A massive regional planning agency that built dams in the Tennessee Valley to generate hydroelectric power, control flooding, and provide electricity to a historically impoverished region. It was a huge example of government initiative driving economic and industrial development across an entire region. Permanent reform, Social Security. The most crucial and lasting legacy of the New Deal are the reform laws created to protect Americans from future economic downturns. The Social Security Act, 1935, was a landmark piece of legislation that, for the first time in history, created a permanent social safety net for Americans. It provided old age insurance for retired workers, unemployment compensation for the jobless, and aid for the blind, disabled, and dependent children. Through this act, the government, for the first time, assumed direct and permanent responsibility for the general welfare of the nation's citizens. National Labor Relations Act, Wagner Act, 1935. This law guaranteed workers the right to form unions, engage in collective bargaining, and strike, significantly empowering labor against the capital power of the Gilded Age industrialists. The New Deal did not entirely end the Depression. The production ramp-up for World War II ultimately eliminated unemployment. However, it forever changed American society and the role of the government.
It preserved the structure of American capitalism, but established the government as an active intervener in the economy and the protector of citizen welfare. The Arsenal of Democracy and Global Hegemony, 1939 to 1945. World War II was the largest and most destructive conflict in human history. For the United States, it represented the ultimate triumph of the New Deal's mobilization capacity and solidified America's position as the world's preeminent economic, military, and political power. From neutrality to the arsenal of democracy. Despite the outbreak of war in Europe in September 1939, the United States initially remained committed to neutrality, wary of repeating the mistakes of World War I. However, FDR clearly recognized the threat posed by Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Cash and carry, 1939. FDR circumvented early neutrality acts by convincing Congress to allow belligerent nations like Britain and France to buy U.S. arms, provided they paid in cash and transported the goods on their own ships. This overwhelmingly favored the Allies, whose navies controlled the Atlantic. The fall of France, 1940. The rapid and shocking defeat of France by Germany in 1940 shattered American complacency. The U.S. realized that Great Britain was the only thing standing between the Nazis and the Atlantic. Lend-Lease Act, March 1, 1941. This was arguably the most crucial act of non-belligerence. It allowed the president to lend or lease war materials to any country whose defense was deemed vital to the security of the United States. It bypassed the need for immediate cash payment and channeled massive amounts of aid to Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. FDR famously described the U.S. role as becoming the arsenal of democracy. Pearl Harbor and total mobilization. The U.S. entry into the war was triggered by the attack on its Pacific Fleet base in Hawaii. The attack, December 7, 1941. Imperial Japan, seeking to cripple the U.S. fleet and clear the way for its expansion across Southeast Asia, launched a devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Over 2,400 Americans were killed, and the Pacific Fleet was severely damaged. A unified nation. The attack instantly ended all lingering isolationist sentiment. On December 8, 1941, Congress declared war on Japan. Germany and Italy responded by declaring war on the U.S., plunging America into a two-front global war. The War Production Board. The U.S. economy, still recovering from the Depression, rapidly transformed into a war machine. The War Production Board allocated resources, converted factories from civilian goods, like cars, to military equipment, tanks, planes, and set production goals. Unemployment, the great scourge of the 1930s, vanished as production reached unprecedented levels. Women entered the workforce en masse as Rosie the Riveter became the iconic symbol of female industrial labor. The two fronts and the atomic age. The United States fought a global war across two main theaters. The European theater. The U.S. first focused on North Africa and Italy before launching the massive cross-channel invasion known as D-Day, June 6, 1944. This operation established a crucial Western front against Nazi Germany, alleviating pressure on the Soviet Union in the East. The Pacific Theater. The war against Japan was characterized by intense island-hopping campaigns designed to slowly push U.S. forces closer to the Japanese home islands. Battles like Midway, Guadalcanal, and Iwo Jima were marked by ferocious fighting and huge casualties. The Manhattan Project. The ultimate conclusion of the war rested on the development of the atomic bomb.
FDR, having secretly authorized the project in 1941, mobilized a colossal scientific and industrial effort. The successful testing and subsequent deployment of atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 forced Japan's surrender and brought World War II to a sudden and terrifying end, simultaneously ushering in the atomic age. The Pax Americana. The conclusion of the war left the United States and the Soviet Union as the two dominant world powers. However, America's position was unique. Economic dominance. The U.S. suffered virtually no physical damage to its industrial infrastructure, like Europe and Japan. The war had created massive economic capacity, leading to decades of post-war prosperity. The Bretton Woods system. The U.S. hosted the 1944 conference that created the International Monetary Fund.